Hi guys, it's Charles here from High Res Tours. We've been having an amazing time over the last few weeks photographing glowworms up in a cave in Northland, and I thought I'd share with you just a few little tips on how to photograph these guys and how to deal with the noise in post-production, which is a problem that we get from having to make such long exposures in this dark cave. So let's jump straight into Lightroom and see what we've got. So I've got two photographs here. The first is a test shot that I took just to check my exposure at a very, very high ISO in the camera. And the second is the actual long exposure. So let me walk you through the settings of both of these images and explain a little bit why I shot them how I did. So when I first entered the cave, I'm using the live view boost mode on my Lumix S1. This overrides any of the exposure settings that you've got dialed into the camera, and instead it pumps up the ISO to 204,800, really, really high, and uses that to send information through to the LCD screen. So that way I can actually look at the back of my camera and compose my shot because I can see the glowworms quite clearly in there. It's really, really useful. It makes focusing a breeze, and I wouldn't do any kind of night or dark photography without using this feature. But even at 204,800 with the refresh rate in live view boost of about half a second, we can't see the rock formations in the cave, and this is kind of an integral part of it. This is something that really draws your eye, that's really interesting. All you see are these sort of bright blue-green dots and some of the threads hanging down. So once I've sort of found a nice bright cluster of glowworms, I'll take a test shot. So I'll put my camera up to its maximum ISO, and I'll run a shot for maybe 8 seconds or 15 seconds just to see what I get. And this is what we've got here. So this was shot at 85mm on the new Lumix S 85mm lens. Really, really lovely lens. Sharp, small, easy to use, easy to focus. Beautiful blurred bokeh in the portrait shots. I had it set to f2.8 here, just to give me a little bit more depth of field. I could have had it wider, but I wanted to make sure that at least most of the glowworms in this range here were in focus. It's tricky in a glowworm cave because, unlike Astro, you can't just focus to infinity and have everything crisp. You've got to kind of really selectively choose where you want that focus to be. So what we've got here, 8 seconds, 204,800 ISO. Obviously, it's really, really noisy. We shouldn't really be taking still photography at that ISO, but it's great just to check where we're at. So I can see that I'm nicely in focus. I can see some interesting detail coming out of the cave, especially in these stalactites that are getting lit up here. And I'm fairly happy with the overall composition. So after taking this shot, what I'm doing is dialing down my ISO. And every time I go down one stop, I'm doubling the shutter speed. So I go from 7.5 seconds to 15 seconds, 15 to 30, 30 to 1 minute, 1 minute to 2, 2 minutes to 4, until I kind of have reached an ISO that I'm happy with, that's going to be clean enough, or I've just kind of exceeded the patience of the amount of time that I was willing to spend there and leave the shutter open. So with an 8-second shot on this one, I calculated that I would need an 8-minute shot to pull me down to 3600 ISO. And I know that on the S1, 3600, it's going to give me a little bit of noise, but it's going to be a kind of film grain kind of look. It's not going to be terrible. It's quite usable. So what I did then was a little bit unusual. I put in my 8 minutes. I left all my other settings the same, and I dialed the exposure all the way down to 640, not the 3600 that I'd actually calculated. This 640 is the base high ISO of the Lumix S1, S5 and S1H cameras. And that's sort of the cleanest ISO that you get once you sort of go over the 100 to 500 mark. I can take a shot at 640 and I can just slide the exposure over in the develop model to anything, you know, to 1600 to 25,000, 51,000, and it will look exactly the same as if I'd actually shot at that ISO in camera, but I'll have the added advantage of having a higher dynamic range, which lets me pull down the highlights and protect the detail in the middle of the glowworm nests. This is making use of something we called ISO invariants. It's a little bit misunderstood. It doesn't help you with noise reduction at all, but it's great for dynamic range. So it's going to protect your highlights, protect your colors a little bit. The disadvantage is that what turns up in the back of the camera after you've taken the shot is really, really dark, sometimes almost pure black. So you've got to be really confident that your settings were fine, which is why I took that test shot earlier. So let's go in and develop this a little bit. First thing I'm going to do is bump up the exposure about 2 stops, which will take us to somewhere around the 3600 mark. So I'll just put a 2 in the exposure tab here. That's lightened it nicely. It's starting to look like that test shot. But like that test shot, I've got this, you know, blown out highlights in the actual center of the glowworms. But now I have the option to pull those back. So I'll start with the whites. That's already bringing back a little bit of detail in these threads here. And then I'll pull down the highlights a little bit as well. And we can see that we've recovered a huge amount of detail here, but the overall image is still quite bright. I might just put up my shadows a little bit just to bring back some of these stalactites. So we've gone from this to this, just with a few sliders. We're almost there. The only problem I've got now, if I zoom in on these dark areas, because this was such a long exposure and because I had long exposure noise reduction turned off, I've got a lot of hot pixels here. But what's interesting is that they're confined to the dark areas of the cave, the really, really black areas. Even when I see them sort of within the rock area here, they're usually in a very, very dark spot. So what I'm going to do, we can't do a lot about the hot pixels in Lightroom itself. I am going to add just a tiny bit of noise reduction just to clean up a certain amount of it. But then it's time to go into Photoshop to get rid of these. So let's do that right now. I'm going to go edit in Adobe Photoshop. I'll just give that a second to load. There we go. Okay, so we're in Photoshop. It's pulled in the file with all our Lightroom adjustments, and as we can see, if I zoom in, yeah, there are all our hot pixels. So what I need to do is run a filter to remove those and then restrict it to the darkest areas of the photo, and that's pretty easy. First thing I'm going to do is duplicate my background layer. I'm then going to rename it to something like hot pixel reduction. We'll then go into our filters. I'll come down to noise and I'll go dust and scratches. And this is, for me, the best filter to get rid of hot pixels. You can see with the default settings and a radius of 2, it's already kind of knocked out everything in the photo. If I set it to 1, I still get a few pixels in this area. So we'll leave it at 2, that's fine. Depending on your camera, sometimes you might have to push it to 3, but it shouldn't really be more than that. So I'll hit OK. That applies that. But we've got a problem here because while it might have removed the hot pixels, it's also made these areas, these light areas, really, really blurry. So I want to bring those back. Now I could just put a mask on this and paint through all the light areas, but there's a faster way to do it. We're going to make use of the Luminance masks that are hidden away in the channels section in Photoshop. I still find it strange that they're not just in the select menu, that there's not a slider for this. that it's only possible with hotkeys, but that's Adobe's decision there. So we're going to click on the Channels tab here, and I'm going to control click on the RGB. And as soon as I do that, you'll notice that it's selected the brightest part of the photos, the very, very center. I want it to select a bit more than that because I remember that through these areas here, they were also relatively hot pixel free. So I'm going to hit Control Shift click and just keep clicking maybe 2 or 3 times until all of those lighter areas are selected. I'm then going to go over to my layers, make sure that my hot pixel reduction layer is the one that's highlighted. Then we'll go down here and add a layer mask. And that's going to make a layer mask that incorporates everything that was already selected. If I alt click on that, we can see that the lighter areas, they are the bits that are being shown. So that's where the hot pixel reduction is being displayed above the other layer. And the dark areas are where it's been hidden. But this is actually the opposite of what we want. We want the hot pixel reduction to be hidden in these light areas so the detail comes through, and to be shown in these dark areas. So all I have to do, making sure my mask is selected, I hit Control I. That inverts the mask. And if we have a look at it now, we'll zoom in a little bit, we've got fantastic detail in all of these glowworm nests, and those hot pixels have completely gone. So if I look at before, noise all over the place, and after, that's completely fine. I've got maybe 1 or 2 pixels remaining if I were to zoom in and look really, really closely. If you've got a few of those, just little ones sort of stranded about, you can just go through with a white brush on the layer mask here, and just paint over those, and they'll disappear. Just be careful not to paint over any areas that have too much detail, because that's going to start blurring them a little bit. Now all I need to do is save this. It's going to send it back into Lightroom, and we're ready to publish it. That's the whole thing. So I hope you enjoyed that, maybe learned something. We've got a lot of glowworm workshops coming up in January. We're also doing some time-lapse workshops in Auckland CBD, and we'll be doing astro workshops from the end of January onwards throughout Auckland and various other spots in New Zealand. If you'd like to join us on any of those, we'd love to have you there. We always have a selection of the latest lenses from Lumix and for other camera bodies, and the latest Lumix cameras and gear. And you're welcome to come and shoot on those. So just head over to highrestours.com, see what's on, and if you're available, maybe we'll see you there. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time.